Hey y'all, this is Scott from Nom Ceramics. I'm one half of Nom Ceramics along with my wife Rebecca Milton. Today we are going to be demonstrating how we make our faceted arched bottom mugs. So this will be a two-part. First I'll throw the mug body on the wheel and facet it, and then a little bit later on I'll show you how we attach the bottom to finish out the mug body. So for these mugs, they're approximately about 12 to 14 ounces in size, and I usually use about 15 ounces of clay. Keep in mind that is bottomless, and some of that weight will be removed when I facet the form with this standard cheese grater, which I love to use. So I've got about 15 ounces of clay, and I'm just going to go ahead and get it centered on the wheel. And when I'm thinking about making these faceted mugs, I really like them to taper from fat at the base to a little bit skinnier at the drinking lip. So when I center a little lower and wider than I would for maybe a bottle form. Something about that size. And because I'm going to be adding a bottom onto this form a little bit later, when I open this up, I'll open it up all the way down to the bat so there's no floor to the pot itself. So I'll open this up. I also don't quite worry if it's totally on center because the little bit of wonkiness still allows me to work pretty accurately, but it gives a little bit of nuance to the pot at the end. It's not quite so rigid. So I'll go ahead and open up the base of this bottomless cylinder pretty wide. And then I'm going to go ahead and throw a cone type shape. Keep in mind that I'm leaving the walls extra thick because a little bit later I'll go facet the walls to give it the form a little bit more specific detail. So I'm going to go ahead and start throwing a cone shape, making sure not to thin out the walls too much. I usually try to do about 3 pulls. So there's one, my second pull, a little bit more height. And my third pull is usually refining the thickness of the wall. So I'm really not trying to get much more height. I'm just making sure that the walls are the proper thickness for faceting the form. And I like to clean up the bottom of the pot at this point. Something like so. So before I go ahead and put the facets on this cup, it's very important to take all the water off the surface of the mug. Otherwise, when you cut and facet, the piece that you cut off will stick to the mug. So I use a metal rib, and with a hand on the inside, I usually do about 2 passes, just taking all the slurry and the water away from the form, like so. And now we're ready to facet. So to keep my facets even, I like to throw on the square bat. So I usually facet at the 4 corners of the square bat, and then I go and do a facet in between each. So I get about 8 facets on each cup. And because there's no guard on this, these things come with a guard on them. I take the guard right out so that I can go deeper or more shallow depending on how thick my wall is. It does take a bit of getting used to, but a couple mugs in, you'll have it dialed in. So I'm just going to go ahead and start faceting the mug. And here's the first slice I took off, and here's the first facet. So I'll work my way from one side to the other. Sometimes I'll accidentally cut through the wall, and if I do, I usually take a piece of this and just patch it. I like the little patch detail. It gives me a spot to glaze later. So I'm on my 4th facet, so I've got all 4 spaced out evenly at the corners of the square bat. Then I'll go through and do another facet in between each of the 4 original facets. So again, there'll be a total of 8 facets. And there we go. So we've got all 4 facets, and we had a 15-ounce mug, and I just removed probably 2 to 3 ounces. 2 to 3 ounces. So now we've got like a 12-ounce mug. Later on, we'll add a bottom to it and probably end up with a mug right around, with a bottom and a handle, right around 1 pound or lighter before drying. And at this point, I'm ready to give this mug some shape. I don't want my mug to just be a tight sort of pyramid shape with facets. So I'm going to go inside with my hand and I'm going to sweep this bottom half out and give it some body. So I try at this point to keep the outside of the mug totally dry. So when I add water, I'm going to very carefully ladle it with my hand down the inside wall. And I'm just going to go through and sweep up the mug, and you'll see it start to expand a little bit. Something like so. So now it's just got a little bit of body to the lower part of the mug. The next step is cleaning out some of the water, and I'll also address the drinking lip, because right now the drinking lip is rather thick and fat. So I usually take the straight edge of a metal rib, and I'll go ahead and sort of, at about a 45-degree angle, I'll take this lip of the mug and make it quite a bit thinner. And the last step of forming is to go ahead and stretch this top out to give it a flare. And to do so, I use kind of a non-traditional method. Basically, I'll take 4 fingers and I'll just spread them. So it looks something like this. I'll add some water, take my 4 fingers on the inside and stretch the mug. And that gives it a nice flare to it. This time I flared it a little much, so I'll just stand it back up a little bit with my finger to give a better angle for drinking. The next thing I'll do is I'll go ahead and get all the water out of the inside of this. And that inside edge, because there's no floor, the clay kind of creeps down towards the center. So I usually clean that out. I'll take the tip of this and just clean out that outer edge of the inside of the floor to look something like that. So we have the finished mug body. I'll spend a little minute or two kind of cleaning some of the slurry off the lip. Keep in mind, these won't be trimmed at all. This is nowhere near on center anymore. And the next step is to go ahead and set this aside for probably about an hour or two till we approach a soft leather hard. And then I will cut out the arch bottom shapes and attach a bottom, which will be the second part of this demo. Thanks. Hey y'all, back with the second part of the faceted tripod mug demo. The piece I threw earlier has now set up. It's been about 3 hours uncovered. I would say this is now a soft leather hard, and I'm ready to cut out the arches in the form and put the new bottom on. So that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to start by cutting out the arch shapes. You can be really methodical about where you cut the arches. I just kind of let them fall where they land. I've done this a number of times, so I kind of know a little bit about the distance to make the feet semi-even, but I really don't stress about it. I let them be a little bit more organic. So I'm taking a pretty sharp knife. I've got my soft leather hard mug body with no bottom. And I'm just going to go ahead and sort of freehand cut out 3 arch shapes. So look about like that. And I leave, you know, somewhere about yay amount in between each cut. So oops, there'll be 3 cuts, and they're not always even. It depends on the shape that you throw, obviously. And again, our forms are pretty organic, so they do move a little bit as I'm doing this, but they're not on center anyway, so it's just fine. So as you can see, I've cut out 3 arch shapes. And the next thing I'm going to do is flip it over, and I'm going to cut back some of this excess clay on each foot. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. Just go ahead and cut off a little bit of the excess. And I'm going to soften these edges where the slab will interact with the foot that I just carved. I'll show you what that looks like here. So what I just did basically is cut a little bit of clay off of each foot, and then this edge, this transition where the slab will lay, I made it a little softer. That way there's not a harsh 90-degree angle here that makes that slab want to split. Oops, I need to grab a scoring tool. No, it's fine. All right. So now I'm set. I have pre-rolled a slab. This is what I would call definitely a soft leather hard. It's about a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 inch thick. It's been setting up for about an hour and a half or so. And that's what I like to use for the bottom. If this is too soft, as you secure it to the bottom, you might, it might become too thin and cause a problem. So it's nice to get it, you know, decently stiff where you can handle it and you can sort of sponge it wet without sort of over manipulating it. So the first thing I'm going to do is, it's got a little bit of texture from my canvas, so I'm going to use a red rib. And I'll show you, I'm just going to take a little bit of that texture off both sides so it doesn't have any canvas texture on it. I'm going to set that aside. The next thing I'm going to do is score and slip the foot really well. So obviously, attaching a foot to a pot, you really want to get in there and score extra well. I like to come at different angles and really put some deep grooves to hold the slip or vinegar in my case, and get that nice and scratched up. Next thing, I just use regular old household vinegar as my slip and apply that with a paintbrush to my scored surface, making sure that every one of those little grooves that I've made gets filled with vinegar. I don't want the vinegar running down the side of the pot. You don't want to over vinegar it, because what happens is everything becomes slippery and it's really hard to keep things clean and tidy. So just enough vinegar to get every groove kind of filled. You know, I have a little run of vinegar right there, no big deal. And then I'm not going to apply vinegar or score and slip the slab side. Because this is still pretty soft, it's a soft leather hard, and this is a soft leather hard, if I can press well enough, I tend to not have a problem. So the next thing I'm going to do is just take my slab, and I'm going to lay it on the mug base, and basically tuck it into each one of these arch shapes. So I've got the mug, I've got the slab sort of tucked into the arch shape, and then I'm going to use my finger just like a paddle and kind of gently paddle that slab down into the contour of that mug body and the grooves that I cut out of it. This isn't an exact science, it's pretty loose. We like our mugs to be nice and organic. So the main thing I'm doing here is just making sure that that clay adheres to my score marks. And you can see the tripod starting to a lot of excess on there, which I'll cut off. So now that I've sort of gently tapped it into my body, I'm going to go ahead and flip it over and trim the excess slab from the body. So I'm going to use a pretty sharp knife, and I usually do this in one cut. I start and just trace the form. So I am cutting that slab, any excess away. And I end up with pretty gnarly, but decently accurate slab on the bottom of my tripoded mug base. The next step is definitely I really love the Falcon roller, is to come in and really adhere that slab to the mug body. So I'm going to come around and just roll that slab into the cuts that I've made for it. And this is the point where it's really making the connection between floor and body. So I might go around 2 times. And really get that set in there. But while doing that, it smooshes the slab over the edge of the body, and you end up with kind of a mess on the outside. You guys can see that there. So the next move is taking a soft sponge and water and just coming back and really cleaning that up, doing long sweeps to sort of combine that slab with the mug body. And I'll do a little bit more cleaning on this later, but right now this wet sponge just kind of takes care of the big sort of most obvious moments where that slab is not meeting the body quite right. And I'll end up with something a little tighter like that. So we're about partway there. We've got the slab on, and I'm going to go ahead and do a little more cleanup while this is right side up, while I can see the mug, how it will be living. I'm really focusing on, sort of gnarly moments where the clay doesn't quite come together, so a soft sponge will just kind of combine those. And just clean it right up. At this point, I have an attached bottom, but the inside of the form is pretty gnarly. The connection between the slab and the mug body wall needs to be combined. That joint needs to be compressed and sealed so later on we don't have a crack or anything like that. So to do so, what I do is I usually use the back end of a paintbrush that has a round shape. So I like this larger one, sometimes even a smaller tip that can get right into that interior seam and smooth that out. So I'll take a little bit of vinegar on the end of my paintbrush, and I'm gonna go ahead, and you won't be able to see this because it'll be vertical, but I'm gonna take this paintbrush and really compress the entire seam all the way around the pot. I'll show you what that looks like when I get finished. So paintbrush with vinegar, and I clean it as I go, taking off the slag that I pick up from doing this process. And without this, I usually get a little separation between the slab on the bottom and the mug body, a little tiny crack that develops. So it's really important to get in there and compress this out. If the slab that you use for the bottom is too thin, when you do this step with the paintbrush and compress that, you're liable to poke through it. So You want it to be a little stiff, the slab, and a little bit thicker so that it can handle this pressure from the paintbrush sort of sealing that seam. So the seam is sealed, but it's also a little haphazard. It needs to be cleaned up again. So that's when I'll go with the larger paintbrush, the tip end, with a little vinegar, and I'll go in and I'll just kind of paint the seam over. So, you know, just following the seam that I just made, smoothing out any irregularities, and also just making it look finished quality. I really try not to leave too much liquid into that seam. You don't want a puddle. You don't want things to be sitting in vinegar or water. So at the end, you end up with something just about like that. The last thing I'm going to do for this guy is sort of clean up the lip because it's got a little bit of damage from being upside down. I'm going to make sure that the bottom is nice and clean. And the last thing I like to do is sort of take a tool. I'm going to use this paintbrush. I use different tools, but I'm going to use the end of this paintbrush and just kind of clean up the outer seam. So I'm just tracing the shape, cleaning up where that seam would be on the outside, putting a groove that defines the body from the foot. So this is the line I just put in. And again, because it's soft, that the act of just doing that also sort of made a little bit of a mess. I'll just go back in with my sponge and soften that again. Again, our aesthetic is very sort of loose and it doesn't have to be totally precise, but you also want it to look finished quality. So, you know, a good deal of time will go into just kind of cleaning up edges and little burrs that the clay made, just to make it look purposeful. And as far as it goes, that's a finished mug body with a floor on it. And the reason why we do this arched bottom is because we like to glaze the bottom. So having more surface area to glaze is what we're all about. So having a flat bottom on a kiln shelf doesn't allow us to glaze this, so we came up with doing this arched bottom. I would probably let this form, because it is soft leather hard, I would probably let this set up again for another hour or so before I go ahead and attach a handle to the mug. And after I attach the handle, I'd probably let it dry, bone dry, and then do a little bit of greenware sanding with a green scrubby pad and get it ready for the bisque kiln. So this is pretty much how we make our tripod faceted mugs. I would also be happy to field any specific questions. My email is scott@eastsidepotshop.com, and have fun making. Thanks.